"You have no idea what's buried beneath this highway," said Detective Angela Torres, as human remains surfaced during a routine construction project. What seemed like just another cold case quickly unraveled into a decades-old mystery of a missing choir girl and the man who had been hiding in plain sight all along. But what came next, no one could have ever predicted. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Detective Angela Torres pulled into the Houston Forensic Science Center parking lot, the summer heat already building despite the early hour. She grabbed her travel mug filled with black coffee and headed inside, nodding to the security guard who'd long stopped asking to see her badge. The air conditioning hit her like a wall of relief as the glass door slid shut behind her. Torres followed her morning routine with practiced precision. She checked her inbox, reviewed overnight reports, and organized her day's tasks in order of priority. At 45, she'd earned her reputation as the department's most methodical investigator. Some colleagues called her obsessive. She preferred the term thorough. "Morning, Torres," said Marcus, a young tech from the DNA lab, poking his head into her office. Those soil samples from the Westheimer case came back negative for blood traces. Her office walls told her story better than she ever could. Framed diplomas, certifications, and a dozen thank you letters from families who'd found closure through her work. The small leather journal on her desk was one of 12 identical volumes she'd filled over 15 years, each containing her private thoughts on cases that had passed through her hands. Some detectives kept their notes strictly professional. Torres believed in recording the human elements too, the grief in a mother's eyes, the relief in a father's shoulders when remains were finally identified. The weekly cold case review meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock. Torres gathered her notes on 3 cases she believed warranted reopening. The oldest dated back to 1972, a missing person case she thought might yield results with new DNA extraction methods. She'd spent hours studying the original files, absorbing investigation techniques from an era when computers were room-sized and DNA was an unknown acronym. She straightened her blazer, checked her reflection in her office window, and headed to the conference room. The meeting had barely started when her phone vibrated against the table. "Torres," she answered, stepping into the hallway. "Detective, this is Officer Ramirez at the Katy Freeway expansion site. Construction crew uncovered what appears to be human remains. They look old." Torres felt her pulse quicken. "How old are we talking? Based on the clothing fragments, decades maybe. And detective, there's something else. Looks like a child." "Secure the scene. I'm on my way." Torres returned to the conference room long enough to gather her notes and make her apologies. 20 minutes later, she ducked under yellow tape at the construction site, the Texas heat now punishing as it reflected off concrete and machinery. The foreman led her to a section where earth had been excavated for a support column. "Operator noticed something weird in the dirt," he explained, pointing to a shallow depression marked with orange flags. Torres knelt at the edge, immediately recognizing the unmistakable curve of a human skull partially embedded in the earth. She felt the familiar focus descend, the world narrowing to just this moment, just this evidence waiting to be understood. "I need a tent over this area immediately," she instructed, already reaching for her phone to call the medical examiner's office. "And get me every photo taken of this excavation since it began." As workers scrambled to comply, Torres noticed something glinting in the soil near the remains. Carefully, she brushed away a thin layer of dirt to reveal a small silver pendant. She photographed it in place before gently extracting it with gloved hands. The tarnished angel pendant turned over in her palm, revealing 3 engraved letters, EMC. Torres stared at the initials, a memory stirring from her early days with the department. A retiring detective had mentioned a case, a choir girl who vanished one Christmas Eve. What was the name? Carter. Ellie Mae Carter. Torres looked from the pendant to the partial remains, knowing her orderly world had just shifted irrevocably. This wasn't just another case. This was a message across decades, a chance to answer questions that had haunted a family for generations. "Who were you waiting for, Ellie?" she whispered. The construction site buzzed with activity as Torres directed the recovery operation. The summer heat pressed down like a physical weight, the air shimmering above the concrete. Workers erected a tent to shield the remains from both sun and curious onlookers gathering at the police line. "I want soil samples from every layer," Torres instructed the forensic technicians who had arrived with their collection kits. "And photograph everything before you move it." She watched their methodical work, her mind already sorting possibilities. The location beneath what would become a freeway support column meant these remains might have stayed hidden forever, if not for the expansion project. Was it coincidence, or had someone chosen this spot knowing it would soon be buried under tons of concrete and asphalt? A tech called her over. "Detective, there's more here." He pointed to fragments of fabric, deteriorated but recognizable as clothing. "Based on the size and what's left of the pattern, I'd say a child's dress." Torres nodded, her suspicions strengthening. She'd pulled the missing persons report for Ellie Mae Carter during the drive to the site. 12 years old, last seen leaving church choir practice on Christmas Eve, 1966, wearing a red dress. The angel pendant sat in an evidence bag in her pocket. EMC, Ellie Mae Carter. Sometimes the universe offered these connections, these chances to bring long overdue answers. "Detective Torres?" A young officer approached. "There's a reporter from the Chronicle trying to get a statement." Torres glanced toward the police line, where a woman with a press badge held up her phone, likely recording. "Tell her we've discovered unidentified remains during construction. No further details until we've completed proper identification." She knew the headlines would start tomorrow regardless. Child's remains found under freeway. Human bones unearthed at construction site. The media attention would be intense, especially if her suspicion about Ellie Mae Carter proved correct. A child missing since 1966, found during a routine highway expansion. It had all the elements of a story people couldn't resist. Back at her office late that evening, Torres spread the initial case file across her desk. The yellowed papers contained the original missing person report, witness statements, and neighborhood canvass reports. A black and white school photo showed a smiling girl with a ribbon in her hair. Torres studied the image, noting the light eyes, the small gap between her front teeth. Most striking were the detective's handwritten notes. Detective Laura Green had conducted a thorough investigation by any standard, but especially for 1966. She'd collected soil samples from the area where Ellie was last seen, preserved fabric from a torn piece of clothing found near the church, and documented every witness statement with meticulous care. Torres felt a connection to this woman she'd never met. This detective who had unknowingly preserved evidence that might finally solve the case decades later. She wondered if Green was still alive, if she might finally see her careful work bear fruit. The medical examiner's preliminary report arrived by email. Female, approximately 10 to 14 years of age, deceased for many decades based on decomposition. Cause of death undetermined, pending further examination. Torres began the process for DNA extraction, knowing it would take time. She also sent a request to locate any living relatives of Ellie Mae Carter who might provide comparison samples. The search led her to Katy, a Houston suburb where Mary Carter now lived in a nursing home. Torres scheduled a visit for the following morning, preparing herself for the difficult conversation ahead. How do you tell someone their child has potentially been found after 56 years of wondering? She drove home well after midnight, her mind still processing the day's discoveries. The skeleton beneath the freeway, the silver angel pendant, the case file preserved for decades. It felt like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled, a story interrupted in 1966 that might finally reach its conclusion. Tomorrow, she would meet the mother who had waited a lifetime for answers about her daughter. Torres fell asleep, wondering what it would be like to carry such uncertainty for so many years, to never know what happened to someone you loved. The nursing home was quiet when Torres arrived. morning sunlight filtering through gauzy curtains. A nurse led her to a private room, where Mary Carter sat in a rocking chair near the window. At 84, Mary had the fragile appearance of a bird, thin white hair, and hands spotted with age. But her blue eyes remained clear and alert. "Mrs. Carter, I'm Detective Angela Torres." Torres took the offered seat across from the elderly woman. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." "You found her, didn't you?" Mary asked, her voice steady. After all these years, the directness caught Torres off guard. "We've found remains that might be your daughter's. I'm here because we need a DNA sample for comparison." Mary nodded, unsurprised. "I always knew someone would find her eventually. I just didn't think I'd still be alive when they did." Torres explained the discovery at the construction site, the angel pendant with EMC engraved on it, and the proximity to where Ellie was last seen. Mary listened without interruption, her hands folded in her lap. "Detective Green used to visit me every year on the anniversary," Mary said when Torres finished. "For 20 years, until her retirement. She promised they wouldn't forget Ellie." "Her work on the case was exceptional," Torres replied. "She preserved evidence using methods that weren't standard practice then. Without her thoroughness, we might not be able to make an identification now." Mary's eyes drifted to a small photograph on her bedside table, a young girl with a ribbon in her hair. "Will you tell me when you know for certain?" "I'll tell you myself," Torres promised. 2 weeks later, Torres returned to the nursing home. The DNA results had confirmed what she'd suspected. The remains were those of Ellie Mae Carter. Mary received the news with the same quiet dignity she'd shown during their first meeting. "Do you know who took her from me?" Mary asked. "Not yet," Torres admitted. "But I'm going to find out. I give you my word." Back at her office, Torres created a dedicated investigation room. She covered the walls with timeline charts, photographs, and maps showing the church, Ellie's home, and the burial site. She immersed herself in 1966 Houston, reading historical accounts and interviewing elderly residents who remembered the neighborhood as it once was. The First Baptist Church building no longer existed, replaced by a commercial complex. County records provided the church's membership roster, and one name caught her attention: Frank Delroy, choir director, who had moved away from Houston in early 1967, just months after Ellie disappeared. Torres spent hours studying Detective Green's original notes. Green had questioned all choir members, including Delroy, who reported seeing Ellie leave practice, but claimed he stayed behind to lock up. Nothing in his statement had raised suspicions then, but viewed through the lens of his departure shortly after the disappearance, Torres wondered if there might be more to his story. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" asked Marcus, the young forensic tech who'd been helping with the case. Torres nodded. "We need to find Frank Delroy." Tracking Delroy's movements over 5 decades required patience. Public records created a trail through 5 states, military service, 2 marriages, various church administration positions, and finally retirement. The surprising discovery was his current address, a modest home in a Houston suburb, less than 20 miles from where Ellie's remains were found. "He came back," Torres said, staring at the address. "After all these years, he came back to Houston." Torres arranged surveillance of Delroy's home, observing the daily routines of an 82-year-old man who attended church weekly and tended a small garden. She watched him interact with neighbors, always polite, always careful. One morning, she observed him pause at his mailbox, staring at a newspaper headline about the remains discovered beneath the freeway. The flash of fear in his expression was brief but unmistakable. Working with prosecutor Renee Fletcher, Torres developed a strategy to obtain Delroy's DNA legally without alerting him. The opportunity came when Marcus, posing as a market researcher, approached Delroy outside his regular grocery store with a survey and complimentary coffee. The discarded cup provided the sample they needed. Meanwhile, Torres applied new extraction techniques to the fabric scrap Detective Green had preserved from the original investigation. The results came on a Friday afternoon. Male DNA isolated from the fabric matched Frank Delroy's profile from the discarded cup. Torres stared at the report, her heart pounding. Science had just connected Frank Delroy to evidence from Ellie's disappearance, contradicting his statement that he had no contact with her that night. After 56 years, the truth was beginning to emerge from the darkness. With the DNA match connecting Delroy to the fabric scrap, Torres secured a search warrant for his residence. The modest brick home sat on a quiet street lined with mature oak trees. Nothing about its exterior suggested the secrets it might hold. "Remember, he's 82 years old," Torres briefed her team. "No dramatic entry. We do this by the book." Delroy answered his door wearing a cardigan despite the Houston heat. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of police on his porch, but he maintained his composure as Torres identified herself and presented the warrant. "May I at least finish my coffee?" he asked, his voice steady. The interior of Delroy's home was meticulously maintained. Family photos lined the hallway, Delroy in military uniform, with 2 different wives over the years, at various church functions. Nothing suggested a man harboring dark secrets. "Check everywhere," Torres instructed her team. "Focus on storage areas, attic, basement, garage. Look for anything from the 1960s. The attic yielded the first significant find. Cardboard boxes containing memorabilia organized by decade. The Houston First Baptist box held church bulletins, choir programs, and photographs. One showed the 1966 Christmas choir, with Delroy standing behind several children, including Ellie Mae Carter. His hand rested on her shoulder. "Detective, you should see this," called an officer from across the attic. He pointed to a weather-beaten trunk pushed against the wall. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, lay a small notebook with a faded leather cover. Torres opened it carefully, finding dated entries from 1966. Most were brief notes about choir performances and church events. But the entry for December 26th, 2 days after Ellie's disappearance, simply read, "Her song stopped too soon." Torres felt a chill despite the stifling heat of the attic. The words seemed to hang in the air, an echo from decades past. The garage search proved even more revealing. Beneath stacked lawn equipment, officers found an old shovel with a weathered wooden handle. Though it appeared clean to the naked eye, Torres suspected it might hold microscopic evidence. "Bag it for the lab," she instructed. "Full spectrum analysis." As they prepared to transport Delroy to the station, Torres noticed his neighbors gathering across the street, watching with confused expressions. They saw an elderly man being led to a police car, not a potential killer who had walked among them. One woman approached, clutching her bathrobe closed. "There must be some mistake," she said. "Frank is a good man. He helps with our neighborhood watch." Torres had encountered this reaction before. Monsters rarely looked the part. The most dangerous predators were those who blended perfectly into their surroundings. At the station, Torres observed Delroy through the one-way glass as he sat in the interview room. His posture remained proper, hands folded on the table, expression neutral. Nothing about him suggested panic or fear, just patient resignation. "Let him sit for a while," Fletcher advised. "Let the laboratory process the shovel first." The results came faster than expected. The lab had detected blood traces in the crevice where the shovel's handle met the metal blade. DNA analysis confirmed it matched Ellie Mae Carter's profile. "We've got him," Fletcher said, reviewing the report. "The shovel connects him directly to her death." Torres nodded, but felt strangely hollow. Evidence was accumulating. Science was speaking across decades. Yet she couldn't help feeling the human element remained elusive. What had happened between the choir director and the 12-year-old girl? What moment of madness or calculation had led to her death? She entered the interview room with the case file and sat across from Delroy. He regarded her with pale blue eyes that gave away nothing. "Do you know why you're here, Mr. Delroy?" Torres began. "I assume it has something to do with that construction site they've been talking about on the news," he replied. Torres placed a photograph of the angel pendant on the table. "Do you recognize this?" Delroy's eyes flickered with something. Recognition, perhaps fear, before returning to their careful blankness. Items like that were popular gifts back then. "This particular one belonged to Ellie Mae Carter," Torres said. "It was found with her remains." "A tragedy," Delroy murmured. "The whole church was devastated when she disappeared." "Including you? You left Houston shortly afterward." "A job opportunity in Dallas," he said smoothly. "Life continues, even after tragedy." Torres placed another photograph on the table, the shovel from his garage. "We found Ellie's blood on this." For the first time, Delroy's composure cracked, just slightly. A twitch at the corner of his mouth, a quick blink. "That's impossible. That shovel is from my gardening." "The DNA says otherwise," Torres countered. "Science doesn't lie, Mr. Delroy, not even after 56 years. The shovel became the centerpiece of the case against Frank Delroy. Torres watched through the laboratory window as technicians carefully examined every inch of the rusted tool. Under specialized lighting, a fingerprint emerged on the wooden handle, preserved in what appeared to be a small spot of Ellie's blood that had seeped into the grain of the wood. "It's a miracle," said the lab director, pointing to the computer screen where the fingerprint was being analyzed. "Wood isn't an ideal preservation medium, but the combination of the blood proteins and the way the handle was stored created perfect conditions." The fingerprint matched Delroy's right index finger. Torres felt a surge of satisfaction as each piece of evidence strengthened the case. Science was bringing justice across an impossible span of time. Torres visited Mary Carter again, this time bringing photographs of the angel pendant. Mary's hands trembled as she reached for the image. "I gave this to her for her 12th birthday," she said, tears forming in her eyes. 3 months before she disappeared. She loved angels, said they watched over her when she was singing. "Did you know Frank Delroy well?" Torres asked gently. Mary nodded slowly. "Everyone knew him. He was the choir director, very respected. The children adored him." She paused, her expression clouding. "He moved away not long after Ellie vanished. I remember thinking it was strange timing, but people said he got a better position at a church in Dallas." "Did anything about his behavior toward Ellie ever concern you?" "No." Mary shook her head firmly. "Or I would have done something. What mother wouldn't?" Torres squeezed the elderly woman's hand, understanding the guilt that lingered even after all these years. Predators are skilled at hiding their true nature, especially back then when people weren't as aware. Mary looked up at Torres, her eyes suddenly sharp. "Are you going to arrest him?" "We already have," Torres assured her, "and we're building a strong case." With the help of Marcus Alvarez, Torres walked the route Ellie would have taken home from choir practice that Christmas Eve. The modern landscape bore little resemblance to 1966. Strip malls stood where houses had been. The old church was long gone, and the Katy Freeway cut through what had once been a quiet neighborhood. They stopped at the construction site where Ellie's remains had been found. Torres consulted the old map she carried. "This is where an alley used to connect Magnolia Street to the church parking lot," she said, pointing to the excavated area. "A shortcut Ellie might have taken." Marcus looked around. "So she disappeared somewhere along here, and her body remained here all these years while the city built over her." Torres nodded, feeling the weight of that reality. She was hidden in plain sight. Back at the department, Torres reviewed security footage from Delroy's neighborhood surveillance. She focused on his interactions with the children who lived nearby, how he watched them from his porch, the careful distance he maintained, the tension in his body when they came too close. She consulted with Dr. Marcia Phillips, a forensic psychologist specializing in long-term offender behavior. "What kind of person keeps a murder weapon for 56 years?" Torres asked, showing her the shovel photographs. "Someone who can't let go," Phillips replied. "These items become trophies, reminders of power or control." The fact that he returned to Houston is significant too. Many perpetrators maintain proximity to crime scenes or burial sites. It's a form of ownership. Torres considered this against Delroy's life history, his church work, his seemingly normal existence, his careful presentation of himself as a respectable citizen. The duality was disturbing, but not uncommon. Monsters often wore the most convincing human masks. The prosecution team met to review the evidence and plan their approach. Fletcher spread the files across the conference table, the DNA match from the fabric scrap, the blood and fingerprint on the shovel. The notebook with its cryptic entry, the timeline of Delroy's departure and eventual return to Houston. "It's circumstantial but compelling," Fletcher concluded. The DNA and fingerprint evidence places him directly with Ellie and connects him to her death. The timing of his departure suggests consciousness of guilt. His return to Houston shows an inability to truly leave the scene of his crime. Torres nodded, satisfied with the case they had built. "We have more than most cold cases ever get." "The defense will attack the evidence preservation," Fletcher warned. "They'll question how these items could remain untainted for 56 years. Then we educate the jury about forensic science," Torres replied. "We show them how DNA persists, how fingerprints can be preserved in blood, how science can speak across decades." As the arrest warrant was processed, Torres visited the Houston Memorial Cemetery where Detective Laura Green was buried. She stood before the simple headstone, feeling a connection to the woman who had preserved the evidence that made this moment possible. "We found her," Torres said quietly, "and we found who took her." "You did good work, Detective Green." She placed a white rose on the grave, a small acknowledgement of the professional dedication that had reached across time to help solve Ellie's case. Tomorrow would bring the formal charges against Frank Delroy, the beginning of a legal process that would test the evidence she had gathered. But today, standing in the quiet cemetery, Torres allowed herself to feel the satisfaction of promises kept, to Ellie, to Mary Carter, and to a detective whose careful work had finally borne fruit. The morning of Frank Delroy's arraignment brought a media circus to the Harris County Courthouse. Television vans lined the street, reporters clutching microphones positioned themselves near the entrance, and curious onlookers gathered behind hastily established barriers. Torres arrived early, parking in the secure lot and entering through a side door to avoid the cameras. Inside the courtroom, she sat beside Fletcher at the prosecution table, reviewing their notes one final time. The doors opened, and officers led Delroy in. He wore a gray suit that hung loosely on his frame, making him appear smaller, frailer than during his arrest. His eyes scanned the room before settling on Torres with an unreadable expression. "All rise," called the bailiff as Judge Eleanor Simmons entered. The charges were read. First-degree murder of Ellie Mae Carter on December 24, 1966. Delroy stood with his court-appointed attorney, his voice steady as he entered his plea, not guilty. Torres had expected this, but still felt a flicker of frustration. The evidence was overwhelming. What defense could possibly overcome the DNA, the fingerprint, the physical items connecting him to Ellie? Her answer came minutes later when Martin Keene rose from the gallery and approached the defense table. "Your Honor, I'll be representing Mr. Delroy from this point forward," Keene announced. Torres felt Fletcher tense beside her. Keene was one of the most respected and feared defense attorneys in Texas, known for his expertise in challenging forensic evidence in cold cases. "Developments already," Fletcher murmured as they left the courtroom. "Someone's funding his defense." "Family members?" Torres suggested. "Maybe. Or perhaps a church organization. Either way, this just got more complicated." The pretrial phase began with discovery motions, evidence reviews, and procedural hearings. Keene immediately filed challenges to the admissibility of the DNA evidence, questioning the chain of custody over 56 years and the reliability of analysis performed on such degraded samples. Torres spent hours preparing documentation on the evidence handling, tracing each item from its collection in 1966 through storage transfers and eventual analysis. She interviewed retired evidence technicians, located original chain of custody forms, and compiled a meticulous timeline of the evidence's journey. "He's trying to bury us in paperwork," she complained to Marcus after a particularly grueling day of documentation. Classic defense strategy. Marcus replied, "If you can't attack the evidence itself, attack how it was handled." The preliminary hearings began with Keene challenging the search warrant for Delroy's home. Judge Simmons listened to arguments from both sides before ruling in the prosecution's favor. The DNA match from the discarded coffee cup had established sufficient probable cause. Next came testimony from forensic experts about the reliability of DNA testing on decades-old samples. The prosecution's witnesses explained the scientific advances that made such analysis possible, while Keene's experts raised questions about degradation and contamination. Through it all, Delroy sat impassively at the defense table, occasionally making notes but rarely speaking even to his attorney. Torres watched him during these proceedings, trying to glimpse the man beneath the carefully maintained exterior. What had driven him to take Ellie's life? What darkness had he hidden beneath his respectable facade all these years? 3 months after the arraignment, as jury selection was about to begin, Keene requested a meeting with Fletcher and Torres. "My client is prepared to offer information about what happened to Ellie Mae Carter," Keene said, when they gathered in a conference room, "in exchange for reduced charges." "What information?" Fletcher asked, her voice neutral, though Torres could sense her interest. "He'll provide details about that night, including the exact circumstances of her death." "We already know what happened," Torres interjected. "The evidence tells the story." Keene smiled slightly. "Does it? You have DNA and a fingerprint that place my client with Ellie. You have a burial location, but you don't know why or how she died. My client can fill those gaps." Fletcher and Torres exchanged glances. "What reduced charges are you suggesting?" Fletcher asked. "Manslaughter instead of first-degree murder, and consideration for his age and health in sentencing." "That's not happening," Fletcher responded firmly. "Your client murdered a child and concealed his crime for over 5 decades. We're not offering a deal." After Keene left, Fletcher turned to Torres. "What do you think he knows that we don't?" Torres shook her head. "He's fishing, trying to see if there are weaknesses in our case." But a small doubt had crept in. What if there were aspects of Ellie's death that the evidence couldn't reveal? The trial date was set for February 2023. As preparation intensified, Torres received a message that Mary Carter wanted to see her. She drove to the nursing home that evening, finding Mary sitting in her usual spot by the window. "The social worker told me about the trial date," Mary said. "I'd like to be there." Torres hesitated. "It will be difficult, Mrs. Carter. The details about what happened to Ellie?" "I've imagined every possible scenario for 56 years, Detective," Mary interrupted gently. "Nothing they say in that courtroom could be worse than what I've already pictured." Torres nodded, understanding. "I'll arrange transportation for you." As she prepared to leave, Mary reached for her hand. "Is it strange that after all this time, I don't feel hatred toward him, just a deep sadness?" "Not strange at all," Torres replied. "Hatred takes energy, and you've needed yours for other things." Mary smiled faintly. "To remember her, to keep her alive in my heart." She looked toward the photograph of Ellie on her bedside table. "I just want to know what happened, not for vengeance, for peace." Torres drove home in silence, thinking about Mary's words. The case had always been about justice for Ellie, about holding Delroy accountable for his actions. But perhaps it was also about something more fundamental, the human need for truth, for completion of a story interrupted decades ago. Rain streaked the windows of the forensic lab as Torres examined the church photograph under specialized lighting. The image showed the First Baptist Christmas Choir of 1966, 20 children arranged in rows, with Frank Delroy standing behind them. Ellie stood in the front row, her smile bright, unaware that within days her life would end. Torres had requested additional analysis of the photograph after noticing something during her case review. The way Delroy's hand rested on Ellie's shoulder seemed possessive compared to his positioning near other children. The lab had discovered his fingerprint on the back of the photo, directly over where Ellie appeared in the image. "We found something else," said the photography analyst, pointing to her computer screen. "Look at the focus quality." Torres leaned closer. "The children in the middle rows are slightly blurred." "Exactly. But Ellie remains in perfect focus despite being in the front row, where any focus issues would typically be most noticeable. This photo was altered in a darkroom, a technique called selective focusing. So Delroy manipulated the image to emphasize Ellie," Torres mused. "When was this done?" "Based on the chemical analysis of the photo paper and development techniques shortly after it was taken, before her disappearance." This discovery suggested Delroy's fixation on Ellie predated her death, supporting the prosecution's theory that her murder wasn't a spontaneous act, but the culmination of an unhealthy obsession. Torres added this information to her growing case file. The district attorney's office scheduled a press conference to discuss the upcoming trial. Fletcher handled most of the questions, emphasizing the scientific evidence while avoiding details that might prejudice potential jurors. Torres stood slightly behind her, uncomfortable with the media attention. "Detective Torres," called a reporter as they were concluding, "how does it feel to solve a case that's been cold for 56 years? Torres hesitated. "The evidence speaks for itself," she finally replied. "My primary concern has always been bringing closure to Ellie's family." As jury selection began, Torres observed the potential jurors carefully. Many seemed fascinated by the cold case aspect, some visibly affected by the fact that the victim had been a child. Keene focused his questions on their understanding of evidence degradation, their beliefs about memory reliability over time, and their ability to separate scientific fact from emotional response. The final jury consisted of 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from 32 to 68. Torres studied their faces during opening statements, trying to gauge their reactions as Fletcher outlined the prosecution's case. "Science has given Ellie Mae Carter a voice," Fletcher told them, her voice steady and compelling. "DNA evidence, fingerprint analysis, and forensic examination have bridged the decades to identify her killer. The evidence will show that Frank Delroy took the life of this 12-year-old girl on Christmas Eve 1966, concealed her body, and has hidden his crime for over half a century." Keene's opening statement acknowledged the tragedy of Ellie's death, but challenged the foundation of the case against his client. "Science evolves, memories fade, contexts disappear," he said, his tone measured and reasonable. "The prosecution asks you to bridge a 56-year gap with certainty, when certainty in such cases is scientifically impossible." Torres took the stand as the first witness, explaining the discovery of Ellie's remains and the subsequent investigation. Under Fletcher's questioning, she presented the evidence methodically: the DNA matches, the fingerprints, the shovel with traces of blood, the notebook entries, and now the manipulated photograph. "The scientific evidence creates a clear narrative," she testified. "Frank Delroy had contact with Ellie on the night she disappeared, contrary to his original statement. His fingerprint appears in her blood on the shovel found in his garage. His DNA was found on a fabric scrap preserved from the original investigation, and the photograph from his possession shows a pre-existing fixation on Ellie." During cross-examination, Keene was respectful but challenging. He questioned not the science itself, but its application across such an extended time frame. "Detective Torres, in your professional opinion, can any scientific analysis completely eliminate the effects of 56 years on physical evidence?" Torres chose her words carefully. Science acknowledges limitations, but the multiple lines of evidence in this case, each independently connecting the defendant to Ellie's disappearance and death, create a compelling picture that can't be dismissed as coincidence or contamination. But not absolute certainty, Keene pressed. Forensic science deals in probabilities, not absolutes, Torres conceded. The DNA match between Mr. Delroy and the fabric scrap has a probability of 99.9%. The fingerprint on the shovel is a 12-point match. Collectively, these probabilities effectively eliminate reasonable alternatives. As she stepped down from the witness stand, Torres caught Mary Carter's eye in the gallery. The elderly woman sat with quiet dignity, her focus unwavering despite the technical and often graphic testimony. Torres wondered what strength it took to sit through these proceedings, to hear the clinical details of what happened to her daughter, after waiting 56 years for answers. The trial continued with testimony from forensic experts who confirmed Torres's findings. A DNA specialist explained how genetic material could survive for decades under certain conditions. A fingerprint analyst detailed how blood proteins can preserve impressions in porous materials like wood. A soil scientist confirmed that mineral composition from samples taken at the burial site matched traces found in Delroy's garage. Throughout these testimonies, Torres observed Delroy. He sat impassively at the defense table, occasionally making notes, but showing little reaction even to the most damning evidence. What thoughts moved behind those pale eyes? What memories haunted his nights? Had he believed himself safe after so many years? Or had he lived in constant expectation of this moment when his past would finally catch up to him? The photograph became a key exhibit, displayed on screens throughout the courtroom. The image of Ellie and her choirmates, a poignant reminder of the life interrupted. Torres wondered if any of those other children, now in their 60s, remembered the quiet choir director who had hidden such darkness behind his respectable facade. The prosecution rested its case after 4 days of testimony, the scientific evidence laid out in meticulous detail. Fletcher appeared confident as she informed Judge Simmons they had presented all their witnesses. Torres felt the same assurance. They had built a compelling case connecting Delroy to Ellie's disappearance and death through multiple lines of evidence. Keene began the defense's case the following morning, calling his first witness, a retired forensic scientist who had worked with the FBI's evidence storage protocols during the 1970s and 80s. Dr. Harrison, based on your experience, what were standard evidence preservation methods in 1966? Keene asked. Quite rudimentary by today's standards, Harrison replied. Cross-contamination was common. Temperature and humidity controls were minimal or non-existent. Documentation was inconsistent. And how might those conditions affect evidence preserved from that era? DNA degradation would be significant. Contamination from other cases stored in proximity would be likely. Chain of custody would be difficult to establish with certainty. Torres watched the jury, noting how several members nodded at these statements. Keene was methodically planting seeds of doubt about the reliability of the evidence without directly challenging the scientific findings themselves. The next witness was a statistics professor who explained probability adjustments necessary when analyzing severely degraded DNA samples. The 99.9% match probability cited by the prosecution assumes optimal sample conditions, he testified. When we factor in degradation over decades, possible contamination, and limited comparison points, that probability can drop significantly, perhaps to 80% or lower. And is 80% sufficient to eliminate reasonable doubt? Keene asked. That's a legal question, not a statistical one, the professor responded carefully. But it means 1 in 5 individuals might also match the sample. Fletcher countered during cross-examination, emphasizing that multiple independent evidence sources all pointed to Delroy. The DNA, the fingerprint, the burial location near his church, his departure timing. Isn't the combined probability of all these factors pointing to an innocent person astronomically low? she challenged. The professor conceded this point, but the damage had been done. Torres could see uncertainty in some jurors' expressions. On the third day of defense testimony, Keene called his surprise witness, Harold Meeks, a man in his late 70s who walked to the stand with a slight limp. Meeks testified that he had worked as a janitor at First Baptist Church in 1966. "Mr. Meeks, were you present at the church on December 24, 1966? Keene asked. "Yes, sir. I was cleaning up after the choir practice." "Did you see Ellie Mae Carter that evening?" Meeks nodded. "I saw her leaving the church, but she wasn't alone." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Torres felt her stomach tighten. This testimony contradicted their timeline. "Who was with her, Mr. Meeks?" "A man. Not Mr. Delroy. Someone I didn't recognize. They left together through the side door." "And why haven't you mentioned this before now?" Meeks shrugged. "I was questioned real brief back then. Just asked if I saw anything unusual. I didn't want to get involved. Wasn't my business. And I couldn't identify the man, so didn't seem important." During cross-examination, Fletcher challenged Meeks's credibility. "You expect this court to believe that you've remembered this specific detail for 56 years? Yet never thought to mention it during the original investigation?" she asked incredulously. "I remember it because it was Christmas Eve," Meeks replied steadily, "and because a few days later, everyone was talking about that missing girl. Things like that stick with you." Torres watched the jury during this exchange. Several seemed conflicted, weighing the scientific evidence against this new testimony that offered an alternative explanation for Ellie's disappearance. After court adjourned, Torres and Fletcher met to discuss strategy. "We need to discredit Meeks," Torres insisted. "His story contradicts not just our timeline, but the physical evidence placing Delroy with Ellie." "I've got researchers digging into his background," Fletcher replied. "But even if we discredit him, Keene has accomplished what he wanted, introducing reasonable doubt." Torres spent that night reviewing the case files, searching for anything that might counter Meeks's testimony. She found nothing specifically contradicting his claim, but noted that his name appeared only briefly in the original investigation reports. He had been questioned and dismissed as having no relevant information. The following morning, Keene called his final witness, a memory researcher who testified about the malleability of recall over time and the problematic nature of witness statements taken decades after events. "Human memory isn't like computer storage," the expert explained. "It's reconstructive, influenced by subsequent information, suggestions, and even the act of retrieval itself. The more time passes, the more opportunities for memory distortion." Fletcher used this testimony to challenge Meeks's account during her closing argument, but Torres could see that some jurors remained troubled by the contradiction between the scientific evidence and the new witness testimony. Keene's closing argument was powerful in its simplicity. This case rests on evidence that has journeyed through 56 years of storage, handling, and advancing scientific understanding. The prosecution asks you for certainty beyond reasonable doubt, but time itself creates reasonable doubt. The statistical limitations of degraded evidence create reasonable doubt. The testimony of Mr. Meeks creates reasonable doubt. The law demands that such doubt benefit the defendant. As the jury filed out to begin deliberations, Torres caught Delroy watching her from the defense table. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and she saw something there she hadn't noticed before. Not fear or defiance, but a strange, sad resignation. It unsettled her more than any emotion she might have expected. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered around both legal teams. Torres slipped away, finding a quiet bench where Mary Carter sat alone, her hands folded in her lap. "What do you think will happen?" Mary asked quietly. Torres chose her words carefully. "The evidence is strong, but historical cases are challenging. Whatever the verdict, we know what happened to Ellie now. That truth exists independently of what the jury decides." Mary nodded slowly. "I didn't come here for vengeance. I came for answers. She gazed out at the courthouse steps where cameras flashed and reporters spoke urgently into microphones. All this commotion over something that happened so long ago. To them, it's an interesting story. To me, it's the reason I've woken up every day for 56 years wondering. The jury deliberations stretched into their second day. Torres paced the hallway outside the courtroom, too restless to sit. She'd been through countless trials, but few had affected her so personally. This case had consumed her for months, had connected her across time to both victim and investigator, had challenged her belief in the sufficiency of scientific evidence. Fletcher joined her, coffee cup in hand. "You need to prepare yourself," she said quietly. "Cold cases are unpredictable in court. The evidence is solid." Torres insisted. "The evidence is solid," Fletcher agreed. But Keene did what good defense attorneys do. He made the jury question not the science itself, but its application across time. And that Meeks' testimony. She shook her head. Torres had spent the previous evening researching Harold Meeks, looking for anything that might discredit his account. His employment records confirmed he had worked at the church in 1966. His brief statement in the original case file mentioned nothing about seeing Ellie leave with anyone. But the file also showed the questioning had been cursory, focused mainly on whether he had noticed anything unusual during his cleaning routine. Why come forward now? Torres wondered aloud. After all these years? Maybe he saw the news coverage. Maybe his conscience bothered him. Or maybe... Fletcher didn't finish the thought, but Torres understood the implication. Maybe Keene had found him and recognized the value of his testimony, regardless of its accuracy. The courthouse buzzed with media and spectators. The case had captured public attention, partly for its cold case aspect, partly for the tragedy of a child lost on Christmas Eve, partly for the drama of modern science reaching back through decades to identify a killer. Torres noticed several elderly people among the onlookers, contemporaries of Ellie and Delroy perhaps, or former church members connecting to a piece of their shared history. Near noon, word came that the jury had questions. Judge Simmons called the court to order as the jury foreman presented their written queries. "We request clarification on the standard for reasonable doubt in cases involving historical evidence. Also, can we see the original notes from Detective Green regarding her interview with Harold Meeks?" The judge provided the legal definition of reasonable doubt and ordered the original case notes brought to the jury room. Torres felt uneasy as she watched these developments. The questions suggested the jury was seriously considering Meeks's testimony against the scientific evidence. "This doesn't look good," Fletcher murmured as they left the courtroom for lunch. They ate in silence at a small cafe across from the courthouse, both lost in thought. Torres pushed her salad around her plate, appetite gone. She thought about Detective Green, about the meticulous work she had done with the limited tools available in 1966. She thought about Mary Carter, waiting for answers for 56 years. She thought about Ellie, 12 years old, walking home from choir practice on Christmas Eve, unaware that her life was about to end. The afternoon brought another jury question. If we find reasonable doubt regarding murder due to the testimony of Mr. Meeks, can we still convict on lesser charges related to concealment of evidence or improper disposal of remains? Fletcher seemed encouraged by this. They're looking for middle ground. They're not buying the full defense narrative that Delroy had no involvement. Judge Simmons instructed the jury that they could indeed consider the lesser charges independently. Torres watched Keene's reaction, a slight frown quickly controlled. He had aimed for full acquittal, but the jury was considering partial conviction. As court adjourned for the day, Torres approached Mary Carter in the gallery. "Would you like a ride back to the nursing home?" Mary shook her head. "My niece is picking me up." She studied Torres's face. "You're worried about the verdict." Torres hesitated, then decided on honesty. "The jury seems troubled by some aspects of the case." "I've waited 56 years," Mary replied with surprising serenity. "I can wait a little longer." That evening, Torres drove to the site where First Baptist Church had once stood. The commercial complex that now occupied the space was closed for the day, its parking lot empty. She tried to imagine the church as it had been. The sanctuary where Ellie had sung in the choir. The side door where Meeks claimed to have seen her leave with an unknown man. The path she would have taken toward home. Torres's phone rang. Marcus calling with a discovery. "I've been digging through property records related to that church," he said, his voice excited. "Guess who purchased a small parcel of land adjacent to the church property in January 1967, just weeks after Ellie disappeared?" "Delroy?" Torres guessed, her pulse quickening. His parents, technically, but he was listed as a co-owner. The land was later incorporated into the freeway development. It's part of the exact area where Ellie's remains were found. Torres felt a surge of vindication. So he had direct connection to the burial site. This contradicts his claim of no involvement. It gets better. I found records of a soil survey done before the freeway construction. That parcel had unusual mineral composition compared to surrounding areas. The same composition found in soil samples from Delroy's garage. "Get this information to Fletcher immediately," Torres instructed. "She needs to present it to the court first thing tomorrow." The third day of deliberations began with Fletcher's motion to introduce the newly discovered evidence. Keene objected strenuously, arguing that it was too late in the proceedings and would unfairly influence the jury. Judge Simmons took the matter under advisement, promising a ruling after the morning recess. During the break, Torres observed Delroy in conversation with Keene. The elderly man seemed agitated, gesturing more than she had seen previously, his composed facade cracking under some internal pressure. Keene placed a restraining hand on his client's arm, speaking in low, urgent tones. When court resumed, Judge Simmons ruled that the property records could be admitted, as they had always been publicly available and relevant to the case. The soil survey information, however, was excluded, as it would require new expert testimony that the defense would have no opportunity to counter. The jury received the additional evidence with noticeable interest. Torres felt cautiously optimistic as they returned to their deliberations. The property connections strengthened their timeline and directly tied Delroy to the burial location, not through scientific inference, but through documented ownership. Late that afternoon, the jury sent word they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly as the news spread. Torres took her seat beside Fletcher, aware of the tension radiating through the space. She glanced back at Mary Carter, who sat with quiet dignity, her eyes fixed on the empty jury box. Across the aisle, Frank Delroy stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. The courtroom fell silent as the jury filed in. Torres studied their faces, looking for clues to their decision, but found only solemn concentration. The foreman handed a folded paper to the bailiff, who delivered it to Judge Simmons. The judge read it silently, her expression revealing nothing before she returned it to the foreman. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" she asked formally. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied, a middle-aged man with salt-and-pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses. "On the count of murder in the first degree, how do you find?" "We find the defendant, Frank Delroy, not guilty." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Torres felt a sinking in her stomach, but kept her expression neutral. She glanced at Mary Carter, who sat motionless, her eyes focused on some middle distance. "On the count of evidence tampering, how do you find?" "We find the defendant guilty." "On the count of improper disposal of human remains, how do you find?" "We find the defendant guilty." The mixed verdict reflected the jury's struggle with the case. Convinced by the scientific evidence that Delroy was involved in concealing Ellie's death and disposing of her body, but not persuaded beyond reasonable doubt that he had committed the murder itself. Meeks's testimony had created just enough uncertainty about the sequence of events on Christmas Eve, 1966, to prevent a murder conviction. Delroy showed no visible reaction to the verdict, sitting as still as Mary Carter across the courtroom. Torres wondered what thoughts moved behind those pale eyes. Relief at avoiding the murder conviction? Resignation at the lesser charges? Or perhaps the strange emptiness that might come from a secret finally exposed after being carried for 56 years? Judge Simmons thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. As the courtroom began to empty, Torres approached Mary Carter, uncertain what comfort she could offer after such an ambiguous resolution. "Are you all right?" she asked softly, taking the seat beside the elderly woman. Mary nodded slowly. "I didn't really expect him to be convicted of murder. Too much time has passed." She turned to Torres with clear eyes. "But the verdict acknowledges his involvement. That's something." Torres walked Mary to her niece's car, promising to keep her informed about the sentencing hearing. As they parted, Mary touched Torres's arm. "Detective Green would be proud of your work," she said. She never gave up hope that someday someone would find the truth. Back in her office, Torres sat alone with her thoughts, trying to process her conflicted feelings about the verdict. The scientific evidence had been compelling. DNA, fingerprints, soil composition, physical proximity, yet still insufficient to overcome the reasonable doubt created by a single witness whose testimony couldn't be definitively disproven. Marcus appeared in her doorway. "Heard about the verdict. You okay?" Torres shrugged. The jury believed the science connecting Delroy to concealing Ellie's death, but not to causing it. "That's still a win," Marcus pointed out. 56 years later, you proved he was involved. That's more than most cold cases ever get. "I know," Torres sighed. "It just feels incomplete." The sentencing hearing arrived on a clear February morning. The media presence had diminished somewhat after the mixed verdict, but several reporters still gathered outside the courthouse. Inside, the atmosphere was subdued compared to the tension of the trial. Judge Simmons addressed Delroy directly before pronouncing sentence. "While the jury did not find sufficient evidence to convict you of murder, they determined beyond reasonable doubt that you were involved in concealing what happened to Ellie Mae Carter, denying her family closure for 56 years. The court cannot overlook the severity of these actions, regardless of the time that has passed." She sentenced him to 7 years in prison, likely a life sentence given his age and declining health. As officers prepared to lead him away, Delroy spoke for the first time since his initial plea. "Your Honor, may I address the court?" Judge Simmons considered briefly, then nodded. "You may." Delroy turned slightly, his gaze moving from the judge to where Mary Carter sat in the gallery. "I want to apologize to Mrs. Carter. Not for taking her daughter's life. I maintain I did not do that, but for not coming forward when I found Ellie." The courtroom fell completely silent as he continued, his voice steady despite his age. "I discovered her body near the church property that night. I was afraid because I had been alone with her earlier, helping her with a solo piece. I panicked. I moved her to land my family owned. I told myself someone else had harmed her, that I was protecting the church from scandal." He paused, seeming to search for words. "I've carried that moment with me every day since. I'm sorry for the pain my silence caused." Torres watched Mary Carter's face during this confession, the slight widening of her eyes, the trembling of her lips, the single tear that tracked down her lined cheek. After 56 years, she was hearing a partial truth about what had happened to her daughter. Not from science or evidence, but from the man who had kept that truth buried for a lifetime. As Delroy was led from the courtroom, Torres approached Mary. "Are you okay?" Mary nodded slowly. "I believe him, at least partly. It makes a strange kind of sense." She looked up at Torres. "Does that change anything legally?" "No," Torres replied. "The verdict stands." And his statement was carefully worded. He admitted to finding and moving her body, but not to causing her death. "We may never know the full truth." "That's all right," Mary said softly. "I know where she is now. I can visit her grave. After 56 years, that's something precious." Torres drove Mary back to the nursing home, their conversation quiet but comfortable. As they pulled up to the entrance, Mary reached for Torres's hand. Thank you for not giving up on Ellie, for treating her case with such care after all this time. I was just doing my job, Torres replied automatically. Mary shook her head. No, you did more than that. You connected to her story, to my story. You cared about the truth, not just the evidence. She squeezed Torres's hand once before releasing it. That makes all the difference. After dropping Mary off, Torres drove to the cemetery where Ellie had been properly buried after the trial preparation had concluded. The simple headstone bore Ellie's name, her dates, and the words, "Her song lives on." Torres placed a small bouquet of daisies beside it, honoring not just the child whose case she had solved, but the detective whose work half a century earlier had made that solution possible. Spring arrived in Houston with a riot of bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush along the highways. 3 months had passed since Frank Delroy's sentencing, and Torres found herself driving to a small ceremony near the site where Ellie's remains had been discovered. The highway department had agreed to place a memorial plaque at the location, a gesture that Mary Carter had requested instead of victim impact compensation. The gathering was small, Mary in her wheelchair, several elderly members of the original church congregation, Marcus, Fletcher, and a few others connected to the case. Torres parked and walked toward the group, noting how the morning sunlight caught the newly installed bronze plaque. It bore Ellie's name, dates, and a simple inscription, "Her song lives on in memory." Mary smiled as Torres approached. "Thank you for coming. It means a lot. I wouldn't have missed it," Torres replied, genuinely touched by the invitation. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. A woman in her 70s, who had been in the choir with Ellie, sang Amazing Grace in a wavering soprano that somehow bridged the decades. Mary placed a single white rose beside the plaque. A retired minister offered a prayer speaking of healing, remembrance, and the enduring power of truth. No one mentioned Delroy or the trial. This moment was about Ellie alone, about acknowledging her life and marking the place where she had rested unknown for so many years. Afterward, Torres stood slightly apart from the group, watching as people spoke quietly with Mary, sharing memories of Ellie or simply offering comfort. She felt a strange sense of completion, not the clean resolution she might have hoped for, but something more complex and ultimately more meaningful. The case had changed her, had shifted her understanding of justice in ways she was still processing. "You did good work," Fletcher said, joining her. "Not many detectives could have built a case across 56 years. Torres nodded, accepting the compliment, but knowing it wasn't hers alone. "I had help. Detective Green's original investigation, the evidence she preserved, Marcus's research skills, your legal strategy." She paused. "And maybe just a little bit of luck. That construction crew finding her remains at this particular moment when the science was advanced enough to make use of the evidence." Fletcher smiled slightly. "I don't think luck had much to do with it, just persistence." She glanced at her watch. "I need to get back to the office. See you at the department meeting on Thursday." Torres nodded, watching as Fletcher departed. The small group was dispersing now, family members helping Mary back to her niece's car, the other attendees drifting toward their vehicles. Torres remained, wanting a moment alone with the memorial. The plaque gleamed in the sunlight, Ellie's name now permanently acknowledged in the landscape. Torres thought about the strange circularity of the case, how Ellie had been buried beneath a highway built over the path she would have taken home, how Delroy had returned to live near the burial site, how construction had eventually revealed what had been hidden for so long. There was a pattern there, a kind of inevitability that suggested some truths couldn't remain buried forever. Back at the Forensic Science Center, Torres found herself approaching her work with a subtly altered perspective. She created a special section in her filing system for what she termed resolved but open cases. Investigations where scientific evidence had provided answers but legal outcomes remained incomplete due to the passage of time, death of suspects, or evidentiary challenges. "What's this new category?" Marcus asked, noticing the label as he delivered lab results. It's for cases like Ellie's, Torres explained, where we know substantially what happened but can't achieve complete legal resolution. They're neither fully solved nor unsolved. They exist in a middle ground. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Makes sense, especially for cold cases where time creates limitations. Torres began mentoring younger forensic scientists, sharing not just technical knowledge, but the ethical and emotional dimensions of cold case work. She organized a seminar series using Ellie's case as a teaching tool with Mary's permission to illustrate both the power and limitations of forensic science across time. We serve two masters, she told her students during one session. Scientific truth and human healing. Sometimes these align perfectly, sometimes they diverge, and knowing how to navigate that divergence is as important as any technical skill you'll develop. The students responded to this approach, many drawn to forensic science not just for the technical challenges, but for the human impact of giving voice to those who could no longer speak for themselves. Torres found unexpected satisfaction in this teaching role, in passing on both knowledge and perspective to those who would continue the work long after she retired. One evening, 6 months after the trial, Torres received a letter forwarded from the district attorney's office. The return address showed the state prison where Delroy was serving his sentence. She hesitated before opening it, uncertain what he might have to say or why he would contact her specifically. The letter was brief, written in a shaky but legible hand. Detective Torres, I've carried Ellie with me for 56 years. In my own way, I've been her guardian, making sure she wasn't forgotten. I don't expect forgiveness or understanding, but I want you to know that she mattered to me then, and she matters to me now. Frank Delroy. Torres read the letter several times, unsure how to interpret its ambiguous message. Was it the closest thing to a confession Delroy could offer? A final manipulation from a man who had spent a lifetime concealing truth? Or something else entirely? A strange, distorted expression of connection to a child whose death he had hidden, but perhaps not caused. She decided not to share the letter with Mary Carter, recognizing that some aspects of closure must remain personal choices, not professional obligations. Instead, she filed it in Ellie's case folder, another fragment of a story that continued to resist complete resolution. That night, Torres wrote in her personal journal, reflecting on how the case had changed her. I believed science could bridge any gap, provide any answer, if applied with sufficient rigor and patience. I still believe in the power of evidence, but I've come to understand that human stories resist such neat resolution. The truth about Ellie's death exists somewhere between the DNA profiles, the jury's verdict, Mary's acceptance, and perhaps even Delroy's cryptic words, not fully captured by any single element, but formed from their intersection. The invitation arrived in Torres's email on a crisp December morning. A simple message from Mary Carter asking if she would attend a special Christmas Eve service at New Hope Baptist Church, the spiritual successor to First Baptist. The date carried obvious significance. Exactly 57 years since Ellie had disappeared. Torres replied immediately, touched that Mary wanted her presence on such a meaningful occasion. Winter in Houston rarely brought truly cold weather, but Christmas Eve arrived with an unusual chill, the temperature dropping into the 40s as the sun set. Torres parked near the modern church building, nothing like the one that had stood in 1966, but located just 2 blocks from the original site. Inside, evergreen boughs and red candles decorated the sanctuary, creating a timeless atmosphere that bridged past and present. Mary sat in the 3rd row, her niece beside her. She smiled as Torres approached, patting the empty space on her other side. I'm glad you could come, she said warmly. It seemed important, somehow. Torres understood. This night, this service, represented a reclaiming of what had been lost, not just Ellie's life, but the sacred associations of Christmas Eve that had been forever altered for Mary by her daughter's disappearance. By attending a choir service on this anniversary, Mary was perhaps healing a wound that had remained open for 57 years. The service began with familiar carols, the congregation joining together in songs that had likely been sung in the original church decades earlier. Then the children's choir assembled at the front, their young voices clear and bright in the vaulted space. A girl about 12 stepped forward for a solo, her clear soprano filling the sanctuary with silent night. Mary reached for Torres's hand, a silent acknowledgement of the moment's poignancy. Not grief exactly, but a bittersweet recognition of time's passage and memory's persistence. After the service, Mary introduced Torres to several elderly church members who remembered Ellie. They shared small stories, how she had loved to sing, how she had once brought her kitten to practice hidden in her coat pocket, how she had helped younger children learn their parts. These weren't dramatic memories, just the ordinary moments that made up a child's life, preserved now in the recollections of those who had known her. Torres listened, absorbing these human details that no case file could ever contain. Over coffee and cookies in the church hall, Mary showed Torres information about a memorial scholarship she had established in Ellie's name, designed to support young choir members pursuing music education. "I wanted something good to come from all this," Mary explained, her voice steady despite her advancing years. "Not just answers about what happened, but something that looks forward instead of back." Torres was moved by this transformation of tragedy into opportunity, this channeling of loss into legacy. Mary had taken the incomplete justice provided by the legal system and expanded it into something more meaningful, a continuation of Ellie's interrupted life through the musical education of other children. "You're remarkable," Torres said simply. Mary shook her head. "I'm just a mother who never stopped loving her daughter." She patted Torres's hand. "And who's grateful to finally know where she is, to have some answers after all these years. Your work gave me that." The following week, Torres received a call from the prison chaplain, informing her that Frank Delroy had died of pneumonia, his health having declined rapidly after his incarceration. She sat with this news for a long moment after hanging up, feeling neither satisfaction nor disappointment. Just a quiet acknowledgement that one chapter in a multifaceted story had concluded. She called Mary to relay the information. The elderly woman received it with similar equanimity. "I stopped hating him years ago. Hate takes too much energy, and I needed mine to remember Ellie." Torres was struck by the wisdom in this statement, the recognition that emotional resources are finite, and their allocation represents a profound choice about how to live with unalterable loss. In Mary's choice to prioritize memory over vengeance, Torres saw a form of strength she had rarely encountered in her professional experience with victims' families, a grace that came not from denying injustice, but from refusing to be defined by it. The new year brought changes to the Forensic Science Center, as Torres implemented revised protocols for engaging with families of cold case victims. She emphasized transparent communication about both the possibilities and limitations of historical investigations, creating a framework that acknowledged the unique challenges of cases separated from the present by decades. "We owe them not just our best scientific efforts, but our honesty about what those efforts can and cannot accomplish," she explained to her team during a training session. "Sometimes complete resolution isn't possible. Evidence degrades, witnesses die, contexts disappear, but partial answers still have value. Identification without prosecution, confirmation of fate without complete explanation of circumstances. These matter to families who have lived with uncertainty." Her approach garnered attention from other departments facing similar challenges with cold cases. Torres was invited to speak at conferences, to contribute to journal articles, to share what she had learned from Ellie's case about the intersection of scientific evidence and human needs across extended timeframes. She accepted these opportunities selectively, always emphasizing that her insights came not just from forensic expertise, but from witnessing Mary Carter's response to partial justice after 56 years of waiting. In her office, Torres kept a small silver angel pendant on her desk, not Ellie's, which remained secured in evidence storage, but a similar one she had purchased as a personal reminder of what the case had taught her. When asked about it by colleagues or visitors, she explained that it represented both scientific persistence and human limitation, the power of evidence to bridge decades and the humility required to recognize when that bridge remained incomplete. The pendant became something of a talisman for Torres, a physical embodiment of her evolved understanding of justice in cold cases. That it arrives not as a thunderbolt of certainty, but as a gradual accumulation of fragments, each one illuminating a portion of truth that, taken together, may never form a perfect whole, but still create enough light to see by. Spring brought another ceremony at Ellie's grave, the first anniversary of her proper burial. Mary invited Torres, along with Detective Green's daughter, who had traveled from California to represent her mother at the gathering. The three women stood together beside the headstone, united by their connection to a child none of them had known in life, but whose story had touched each of them profoundly. "My mother would be pleased," Green's daughter said, looking at the simple marker with its inscription about Ellie's song living on. "She never forgot this case." "Neither will we," Torres replied, placing a white rose beside the stone. As she drove away from the cemetery, Torres thought about the continuity represented by their gathering, how Detective Green's work had enabled her own, how both had served Mary's need for truth, how all of it together had finally given Ellie back her name and place in the world. It was a connection across time that transcended the limitations of evidence, the constraints of legal proceedings, the incompleteness of human knowledge. In that connection, Torres found a deeper meaning to her work than any single solved case could provide. A recognition that truth matters not just for its own sake, but for the healing it makes possible, however delayed, however partial.